Oh, hello and welcome to this session in which we're going to talk about how the ePerspectives digital enterprise method and framework will give us a very crisp and clear approach into dealing with mergers and demergers. I'm Arsalan Rad. We'll start by a very quick review of what is digital transformation and what is ePerspectives. You have access to these in the other presentations which detail this more, so I will do this a little bit faster. So we looked at the paradigm shift in the electronics world when we moved from analog and old tedious ways to the new way, which is digital, where we have a componentized approach. We have everything on in a one pager, a circuit diagram. It's end to end, it's traceable, it's sequential, and it's componentized. And again, what it does is also encapsulates functionality. So that component that you see, for example, it could be an amplifier, and it encapsulates anything with amplification black boxes that nobody needs to know what's going on inside. As a vending machine analogy we talked about, nobody cares about what happens, all the engineering and science within a vending machine. All we care about is the interfacing to it, how we use it. We take a coin, we insert it, and we press on the interface the product that we want, and we take that. This is the same. We can replace this amplifier, for example, component with a better one, with a better amplification. As long as it maintains the same interfaces, the same legs, we can reinsert it, and this circuit will go on seamlessly from the next moment, doing everything. So this is the very definition of agility that we achieve through this componentization. Everything will carry on seamlessly, but with better functionality. Now, we thought, well, gee, wouldn't business want to have the same kind of paradigm? So of course it does. We have the same situation with business organization. They are tedious. There are too many versions of data, too many mindsets, terminologies, too many vendors, too many solutions, too many things happening, and it's very hard to consolidate them in a way that we can distill and understand them. And more importantly, what we want to do, that when business has a new idea or a new product to go out to the market with, that it can do that with agility and speed. And obviously it can't be done in the top diagram, but when we have when we look at our business enterprise through the lenses of the ePerspectives framework, we look at it as a digital circuit of our business enterprise. So everything is componentized again with minimum number of couplings and better cohesion. And I don't need to say more because you can just draw the parallel with the electronic circuits and we get all the advantages. So the business agility means we can replace components easily and put a better component there, or we find the locate where we need to do. We can trace things in business, therefore we get the better flexibility. So we go from the traditional enterprise to the digital enterprise, leveraging the digital enterprise method and framework, which is called ePerspectives. This is what we want to do and achieve. That is to say, same digital the digital concept that we have in electronic circuits. We want to achieve the same within the business organization and hence get the same advantages that it brings. So let's remind ourselves very quickly of the ePerspective Digital Enterprise Framework that we look at three key perspectives of business, enterprise, and change, supported by two perspectives, horizontal perspectives of enterprise planning and operations. The business perspective is about first business strategy sub-perspective. This is where we figure out what we want to be to the outside world, how we interact to the outside world, how we make ourselves different to the outside world and unique, and then define our high-level strategic capabilities and services. This is what the business wants to do. Then we move to business design that says how the business does what it set itself out to achieve. That is to say, define the best operating model, the best processes, the best organization, as well as the best CX, customer experience. That is, when people interact with us, how they experience their interaction with us, so that we have the best way to operate the business to satisfy what the business strategy defined for us to achieve. Then we look at the enterprise perspective, and while we have maintained that the business perspective is implementation agnostic, so it doesn't take into account whatever we need to do from an implementation point of view, it only focuses on business, because today we may have limitations with our implementation, but tomorrow we might very well have much more possibilities. So the business design and strategy need to be in the best way, looking at how we want to do it ideally. Whereas when we come to enterprise perspective, we look at how we implement that optimally. So what is the organization, the technology, how do we plan things, how do we bring things together, everything that needs to be in place to support the business perspective so that its ideas can be implemented and it can do what it wants to do. Then we talked about the change perspective, which we split into two sub-perspectives of change planning and change realization. In change planning, we make sure that we have a very clear and sound foundation for applying the change and implementation so that we can do that the right way. So looking at business perspective, inside of it, now we're looking at the inside out view. As I mentioned, nothing that is inside a perspective or a sub-perspective is relevant to any other sub-perspective except its interaction points, except its input-output part. So we will cover this now, but anybody who's not basically working within the business strategy sub-perspective can basically switch off now, because they don't need to know any of this. That's one of the beauties of the ePerspectives framework, that we only focus on the things cohesively that have to do with our own perspective, which is our own daily concern. But nevertheless, for curiosity, for those who are curious outside the perspective, but also for those who are inside, this is what we do here. We look at strategy development methods such as Lean Sigma, Six Sigma, such as TQM, Enterprise Strategic Analysis Transformation, ESAT, and such. There is value chain optimization, competitive analysis, balanced scorecards, and all that science that, again, we need to shield the rest of the world from. But that's only people who are within this sub-perspective that are concerning themselves with it. And in here, this is what we look at to define our strategy, and then it's about distilling that strategy. So in here you see, for example, business canvas modeling, which is a very good technique to do accelerated distillation of business strategy. And then there's this mapping of strategic capabilities. You see that that matrix, that little matrix there, which is MIT's X matrix, which is a four-way matrix that maps strategic capabilities and services to strategic values, strategic objectives, and most importantly, KPIs, or key performance indicator metrics that we can, through this, we can measure every strategic capability. As we said, we want every strategic capability to have a measurable business value going forward, going downstream from now on. So anything that we do in future, we should be able to assess what is the business value that is in the scope of the impact. So doing all this work, again, nobody else needs to know all this stuff except those who are within the business strategy perspective. They feed it into what is called the strategic capability model, which is a model that captures high-level capabilities, strategic capabilities that we have. And obviously through the link that we've defined, then for every capability, we can derive its strategic business value. Now, the next is, now we figured out what the business wants to be to the outside world and what are its key capabilities, strategic capabilities. Now that we want to know what the business wants to do, now that we know what the business wants to do, we're going to look at how the business is going to achieve that best. So we're going to look at defining our business operating model. So we look at processes, services, organization that is in place, functionality, and organized structure, like how we do that best, And then we also look at value stream mapping to customer journeys, in this case, to be sure that when the outside world, including clients, when they are interacting with us, that they have the best experience. So this is about operating model and how. So all this knowledge we capture and encapsulate into what we call a business capability model. It starts as default with a strategic capability model and gets more and more detailed through doing the business design work, and the output, the final outcome comes and gets encapsulated in a business capability model, which basically tells us our business operating model and also our future organization structure. So in an optimal scenario, in the best case scenario, our future organization has to be organized similar or in accordance, in adherence to this business capability model. So we have both functionality as well as structure. Now, as we have said before, the business perspective is implementation agnostic. We do business strategy and business design ideally. So we don't take into account what constraints we may have, what IT we may have, what budgets we may have, etc. But we do that as an ideal exercise because we know that today we may have constraints from the point of view of IT or people and organization, but tomorrow those constraints can have become overcome. So the business perspective is strategized and designed ideally, whereas now we come to the enterprise perspective, where we look at how we implement that optimally. That is to say, what is the support organization, technology, how we plan things, how we put everything about the enterprise in place to support this business so that it can function the right way and provide what what it's set itself out to provide to the outside world, basically the best way. So we looked at these two aspects, and then looking at change planning. So in the enterprise perspective, we look at in the enterprise IT side, we look at data, application, and technology, basically IT architecture. And then on the organizational side, we look at people and resourcing. So for every capability, we need to profile it from that point of view. Obviously, we have access to the business and business strategy through the business capability model that we have, and we have a change portfolio link also. So we look at the change portfolio that we have later. So essentially, this is where we look at an enterprise capability model, where we start with the business capability model as a default, and then we map it into the four aspects of IT and technology, business value, organizational value, as well as change portfolio in here. And then do an optimization exercise, which is also called heat mapping. We look at the different capabilities. We profile them in a 360-degree 4+1 way. So everything is fully fact-based. And then we can do what-if scenario analysis, ROI-based, business case-based analysis and decision-making. And eventually, the heat-mapped version of the enterprise capability model becomes the default value of what we call a change capability model. So change capability model is a subset of the enterprise capability model, where we are going to decide where the changes should be and based on what priorities. So we define the roadmaps. In order to do that, we talked about capability-driven solutioning and planning. We're not going to get into that, but why it's very important to have this as capability-based, right, in order to maintain mutual integrity when we go to implementation. So this gives us a very sound capability-driven basis in order for us to define our implementation roadmap and then go and do our change realization. So this is the black box view, as I mentioned. So everything that happens internally, we black box it. So there is this golden thread, which is what we call it an XCM, which goes through 4 different evolution stages of SCM, BCM, ECM, and CCM. I'll explain that in here. So SCM is high-level strategic capability model, when we ask ourselves, what does the business want to do and achieve? And they define the strategic capabilities high level, and we make sure they are mapped into a business strategy value. Then we look at the BCM, where we look at how does the business operate from a point of view of its functionality and its structure, so that it can best accommodate. So what is the operating model we need in place to best accommodate what the business wants to achieve defined by its strategy. Then the business capability model becomes the default value when we go to ECM, where we do the 4+1. As I said, this is now we ask the question, how does the enterprise operate to optimally accommodate and implement the business? So business BCM was agnostic to implementation. Now we make it implementable by doing an optimization exercise. And last, we look at the CCM, which is a subset of the enterprise capability model, where we have identified our priorities or the right place, what are the key capabilities that we want to address according to what order, and we devise a roadmap. So now look at mergers and demergers. What do we do here? So we look at SCM, BCM, ECM, and CCM. Remember, we talk about one central document and artifact within ePerspectives, only one, and that's called an XCM. So all of it is consolidated to one. The rest nobody else has to bother about. And in fact, even this one, the XCM, the only people who bother about it are people whose function goes across the enterprise. So for example, COOs or CEOs or CIOs or heads of portfolios and such. So we look at the SCM first when we do mergers and demergers. Let me preface that by this. So many times I've seen that when there's a merger-demerger scenario, what people do is start by infrastructure, looking at, okay, let's look at all the IT and even infrastructure, not only apps, but the infrastructure. What is the IS that this one has? What is the IS that the other one? And how do we merge them? And that can't be really more pathetic than that, really, honestly, because we're not doing infrastructure. So we need to first figure out what we want to do from the two business point of view, like if they're merging or demerging, so that we can best consolidate or split them. So we need to start upstream. So we look at SCM. So here's, we look at the synergies and differences at the XCM level for every part. So we look at analyzing, and for example, in SCM, we look at both of the entities that we're going to merge together, and then look at the strategic capability map for both of them. And since they have value, we can derive value, and we can now compare apples with apples and take a good, better understanding about, okay, so this one has, for example, this capability when it comes to customer management or order management. This one has this order management capability strategically. Looking at them from a value and so on, then we start looking at, do we keep one of them, or are we planning to sort of merge the two and get the best of both of them together? The same applies when we go to the business capability model. The same way, now we have more details, so we have processes to look at and the organization, even the CX to look at. So this is where we look at the two merging or demerging entities and say, okay, for example, order management has these processes, the order management for the other one has these processes. So let's look at them and see which one has the better processes, which ones do we want to keep. Okay, for example, we keep these three, and so from now on, the second entity will also use the same processes that the first one does. Or sometimes we think, okay, this one has some good points, this one has some good points, so we have to devise a way to bring them together. So merge the processes together, and that is at the sub-process level. So we need to go to granular level, find the right granularity, and make sure that we apply the changes. Then it's an ECM part when we now have the mapping into IT and business value and organization and change. Therefore, we can then look at the services and where are the differences. So here we can look at a given service and say, okay, the first entity has this IT landscape for it, this business value, this is the organization scope for it, and currently they're doing these changes in terms of the projects. Look at the other one, and then we have, again, two two templates which are from different companies, but they have the same, we use the same template, we use the same parameters. So again, we can compare apples and apples, and then we can look at, okay, for this given functionality, order management, for example, we have these 4 applications for the entity 1, but entity 2 has 8 applications. And now we can start looking at them and see which ones we can keep, which ones we can remove, or whether we need to mix some of them together. Last is the CCM, so we go very directly to the change capability model. Now we have identified exactly the merger demerger scope that is in place, where not, so we don't change everything, we don't run out and change everything, but just go, we have been able to really locate and identify where the M and D, so merger and demerger aspects that we need to take into account, where they apply in terms of applications, processes, organization, and such. And then by comparing them, then we can make the best decisions about which one to keep or whether to combine them. So looking at strategic capability model here, these are some examples this is from the telecoms world. So you see there are high-level strategic capabilities, and this is how we map them using an X matrix to KPIs, to strategic values, stakeholder values, as well as the strategic objectives. So we can have, for every business capability, we can have a measurable strategic business value. Now we look at what we do with the business strategy impact. Now we focus on the strategic capability model, assess its capability, and analyze whether or to what extent it is relevant to M&D. So there could be very good, it could be very, well, the scenario that we look at the strategic capability and find out, well, this has nothing to do with the merger of the two companies. For example, one of them has it, the other one doesn't have it, so we're very good. We can just rely on this. Excuse me. Then we assess the strategy X matrix. Again, this is to look at the business value, and since the strategic capability is mapped to it, so we can assess it from the point of view of stakeholder views, strategic goals, but most importantly, KPIs. So we can relate the M&D related, we can identify the M&D related KPIs. So what strategic, what capabilities we have that have to follow M&D, merger and demerger KPIs, related KPIs. So we create a subset of the SCM that only has the strategic capabilities that have M&D impact. So the rest of it we don't have to worry about because it's not in scope, and this defines for us the scope from a business strategy point of view when we are merging or demerging these two companies. Moving on, it will be looking at the business capability model, right? So this is the more advanced version of a strategic capability model. This is our business operating model. Basically, we've covered this in the previous presentations. So here we talked about heat mapping, looking at, in this case, from a point of view of merger and demerger. So we look at our business capability model and look at the different capabilities and relate them to M&D. Okay, is this one relevant when we do merging these two companies together? Is it relevant? If it's not, then it's not in scope. So the orange, for example, has no impact, whereas we can see which parts have high impact, low impact, medium priority, and then in this case, just to make a point, we've shown one that has some that are outsourced. So basically, we know what needs to be done, but somebody else has to do it. So then, looking at the business design, similarly, now we are focusing on the business capability model and look at every business capability and find out what are the aspects of this one when we're dealing with merger and demerger. If you don't have one, because many organizations don't have a business capability model, then same as strategic capability model, there are ways to do accelerated work, so that we could do, for example, accelerated business canvas modeling to devise a strategic and an X matrix exercise to devise to get us a strategic capability model. The same way we can quickly do some accelerated business modeling and customer journey modeling and or org modeling and quickly devise a business capability model that we think is most valid for us. And then for each business capability that we look at it, are you relevant from a point of view of merger and demerger? And then we look at we assess the business operating model from point of view of, okay, this capability has impact. So what processes or services that are, or sub-processes that are inside of it are also in scope, are relevant to this merger, demerger. And then we identify which business and thereby which organization entities are relevant. So through this, we find out, for example, that we need a couple of places in our organization that we need to train some people or bring in, hire some people, or we need to apply some changes so that we can do this merger, demerger as we intend to do. And the same with the customer journeys. So essentially here we provide a subset of the business capability model that only highlights very specifically for us how we want to address the merger, demerger aspects, not the rest of the stuff. It is very much located, which gives us a huge advantage. So this gives us the scope for doing the what we need to do from a business capability, business perspective point of view when we do a merger, demerger. Next, we're going to look at the enterprise perspective. So if you recall, we talked about the 4+1 360-degree model, in which we start with the business capability model and map it to all this in a 360-degree to business strategy, technology and IT organization, as well as the change portfolio. And we establish a 360-degree view of what we have, how we want to implement our business. So in here, if you recall, we had these different lenses of business value, org, IT technology, and portfolio lens that we take a business capability model through in order to devise an enterprise capability model the right way, and then heat map it in terms of what is priority, what is more important to us, what is less important to us, and such. In this, our key lens to this is obviously mergers and demergers. So for every capability, when we look through these lenses, we will have focus on whether the given capability, what the aspects may or may not be in regards to merger and demerger, right? Nothing else. So that is key focus for us. And then we can do an heat mapping on the enterprise capability model, where we can look at, okay, these areas are considered critical for us when we're merging these two companies. Whereas there are some have medium and some have low or no impact. And that will be for us a basis to do this. And so to summarize enterprise architecture, but an enterprise perspective, impact analysis, we focus on the ECM, we assess the ECM. If we don't have it, we need to define an accelerated way to the 4+1 mapping. We call it strategic baselining exercise to get an ECM in an accelerated way. It can be done in 8 to 12 weeks time in a medium sort of large organization. And then we look at for every capability, we then take into account the M&D related, merger and demerger related aspects of business profile, organization, enterprise IT, as well as change. And then therefore, I'm looking at each one of them specifically with the lenses of M and D. Then we create a subset of ECM that has only the parts that have M and D impact. And this provides for us the M&D related enterprise architecture parameters, which we have them baseline so that we can implement them, bring them into place. And we have a granular future M&D services, M&D IT services. So merger, demerger, when it happens, we've identified what are the future IT services that we need to provide granularly when we do the ECM exercise. So we can now look at how they're going to be implemented as microservices. Now, this is an important point why I brought this one, because this gives us a possibility here to define microservices that we can use to interact with the outside world, for example, with regtex or regulatory bodies, so that we give them an entrance through the ECM to be able to access our business and get the reports that they want. And therefore, we are baselining the ECM with focus on the merger, demerger scope, what parts of it are in scope for it, and then moving on to the next. And as mentioned, heat mapping in the ECM will give us the subset, which is later called the CCM, a change capability model, in which we only have the areas that are in scope for change. In this case, it naturally means which ones are in scope for change for merger and demerger, nothing else. It's not about rationalization or other things. So with that in mind, we focus on this and devise a roadmap. We talked about doing it in a capability-driven approach. So now we're focusing on a change capability model, assess each capability and analyze whether, to what extent it is relevant to the M&D, and then assess the CCM. Again, if you don't have a CCM, we need to apply to do a heat mapping exercise on the enterprise capability model to derive a CCM. And then for every one of the change capabilities, when we look at them from an M&D impact point of view, assess and this in relationship. So we devise a capability-driven solutioning. This is what we said here is important. Everything is capability-driven within ePerspectives. So we do this capability-driven solutioning and planning with focus on regulatory compliance. This is where, for example, in solutioning, we can for the first time, start looking at what packages or what applications are available that could be used, for example, for different purposes if needed. So not before that. So we are not looking at applications until now, as opposed to many doing it when they're doing mergers and demergers. The first thing they start thinking about is how do we consolidate our applications and infrastructure. And so we have defined a scope for it, and this gives us very clearly where the changes are, what is our implementation roadmap, and then we follow that and implement whatever is needed in terms of M&D. So that means in this case, if we are merging together, then we have decided, for example, that we're going to consolidate 2 enterprise applications from both entities. In here, we devise the solution and we plan the solution with focus on what needs to be done, and we provide and we create a project that will go and implement it. And if it's a demerger, then would be like, okay, projects to define, perhaps to untangle, to remove, to decommission, or to basically remove some of the applications we want because we are demerging and we no longer need them, for example, for some functionalities we used to support before. So going back, this is a quick version of the XCM, in which you can see on the leftmost side in the light blue, you see the link to our business strategy sub-perspective. So you see on the very left side, you see the how we derive from the X matrix a strategic value. Then you see the strategic capability itself. So that shows to us that we are using one document, and in it we have strategic capabilities measurable from a business point of view. Then the same strategic capabilities become default for what is here business capability. And business capabilities, if you click on the real version of this, we look at the process maps or descriptions and other things about the customer experience, for example, for a given process. So customer journey for a given process. So this is the business perspective in which we now can look at every capability and say, are you in scope for our M&D? Or for example, this one is from company A, and company B has this one the same or has something different, and we can go look at the sub processes and find the delta. Where is the difference in order to bring it to the right level and implement it? Then we look at here in the brown orange section where we look at the enterprise capability model, where the same capabilities are now mapped to IT architecture, that is app, data, and technology, as well as the organization. As I mentioned, from a 4+1 point of view, the capabilities on the orange are also mapped obviously to the left, to the business. So there's a link to business, so we can derive the business value. And they're also from the right connected to the change perspective, so we can look at the change aspects. So the true 4+1 360-degree application of 4+1 into the enterprise capability model. And when we do the heat mapping here, look at, okay, what apps, what data, what are our priorities and things like that. Then finally we stabilized our ECM, and then we get a heat map version of it that for us outlines our priorities and constraints and gives us the possibility to start devising a roadmap when we do in green based on the same capability, with the same capability-driven approach. We do capability-driven planning and solutioning, and everything follows as you see here naturally. So work packets, when we do a project plan, work packets will be capability-based and they will maintain mutual integrity, and we will be focusing very clearly where are the deltas, where is the merger or demerger aspects of it. So then we have a very clear way of where we need to go and what we need to change. On that note, I would like to say thank you for the time. I look forward to the next presentation sessions. Thank you.